What is the right move in the Rams passing game with Cooper Kupp back? That more this week on the couch. Happy to be joined again by a veteran who has a foot in the beat writer world, and he's been there to tell the tales to the fantasy football world. Tom Kessenich. Tom, what's the right move in the Rams wide receiver group?
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Going to be interesting to see what happens. Interesting to see when Cooper Kupp returns, if it's going to be this week. Certainly a great matchup. I mean, the Eagles' secondaries had problems pretty much since week one. I mean, the Patriots lit them up pretty good in that first Sunday game. They haven't been able to bounce back at all season. I mean, Arizona got to them pretty good this past Sunday. So I think it's a really good matchup for Matt Stafford and the Rams. And if Cooper Kupp can return, okay, so what do we do? I don't think we worry about Puka Nacua at all. I mean, they need him, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So he'll be the number two or 1B, if you will, opposite Kupp, if Cooper Kupp is healthy. And so I think Tutu Atwell kind of moves into that third spot. Now, they have been able to complement three wide receivers in this offense before, right? You go back to kind of their heyday with Jared Goff, years ago. They had Woods and Brandon Cooks and Kupp in those three roles. So this offense at its best can support three good fantasy wide receivers. So, if you got Tutu Atwell, I mean, he's kind of the guy who's going to fall off a little bit here, but he still, I think, can be a viable wide receiver three, especially with bye week starting up right now. But Kupp and Kupp and Nacua, they're the strong alphas in this passing game. And maybe Higbee a little bit
Mm-hmm.
as a tight end. Again, we got bye week starting up now. So I think he'll be in there a little bit as well. But, you got Kupp, Nacua, and to a lesser extent, I think Tutu Atwell as maybe a wide receiver three-ish, kind of play there. But,
Right.
Don't worry about Nacua at all. I mean, he's proved himself, and I
Right.
think the Rams badly need him.
Right. When we have a player where we say, here's the club of players that have done this in the first 4 weeks of their career, and it's just Puka Nacua. Now, I had someone ask me, Tom, who's going to be worth more, Puka or Cooper? I'm not saying you need to. I mean, I think I'd still rather have Cooper Kupp at this point than Puka
Right.
Nacua. But is it close enough that that's not a crazy question?
I don't think it is. I mean, we got to see what Cooper Kupp is right now, right? I mean, we know what
Right.
he has been, and what he has been is amazing, but we haven't seen him, since what? I mean, about a year ago
Right.
almost, right? I mean, it's been a long time. So we got to see what Cooper Kupp is. And if he's 75% of what we last saw, that's still better than, most wide receivers in the NFL. But obviously, if he's 100% of what he was, he's better than nearly every wide receiver in the NFL, and that includes Puka Nacua.
Right.
So we need to see what Cooper Kupp is, and the Rams do too. But obviously, the Rams want to get him back as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that the question about Cooper Kupp is how much of his volume was because he's a really, really good wide receiver, but at the same time, how much of it was because his role in the offense just made him the primary target. And now, like you said, there's two primary targets. What does that look like? What is the Rams? I'm sorry, what are the Colts backfield? What does that look like? Do you think that this is something where, hey, get in and trade for Jonathan Taylor right now, whatever it costs, because once he's out there playing with Anthony Richardson, remember all that stuff that happened in the preseason, we didn't know that Anthony Richardson was going to be this good and this big of an influence. You mentioned Sean McVay saying, yeah, playing against Anthony Richardson, that dude's a problem. That dude's a
Yeah.
problem. So is it like we're underestimating Jonathan Taylor? Is there still too much uncertainty? Is Zach Moss done enough to muddy this picture? What's the right move with Taylor?
Well, I mean, we don't know what is going on there. I mean, we're getting reports that he still doesn't want to be there. So is he still going to be there? Now, we've seen Zach Moss, right? He got plenty of chances in Buffalo. It's not like he didn't get an opportunity in Buffalo on a good team, a really good team. He got an opportunity and he failed. So I don't know what's happened with this guy
Mm-hmm.
in Indianapolis. It's not like, again, whatever's going on with Zach Moss, and congratulations to everybody who got Zach Moss right now.
Right, right.
You're living the dream with this guy.
Zach Moss
right?
and Kyron Williams. Yeah.
Yeah. You're living the dream. I mean, I have no shares. I mean, congratulations. You're living right. You got the charm, it's working.
Yeah.
But again, Zach Moss got every chance in Buffalo to be this guy that we're seeing right now. And it didn't happen on a really good a better team than what he's playing on right now. Okay. So Jonathan Taylor is a much better running back than Zach Moss. So if Zach Moss is doing this, imagine what Jonathan Taylor can do if he comes right back into this situation. Okay. I mean, he'll blow the doors off this thing. And if that happens, imagine all the teams that refuse to pay 50 cents on the dollar for Jonathan Taylor right now, because that's the asking price.
Right.
I mean, the Colts are willing to give him away right now, and apparently nobody wants this guy. I'm baffled by this whole situation.
Yes. Well, I'm baffled too, Tom. Let's just take this to more of the sports talk category. Okay, pay him $50 million for 3 years with, $30 million guaranteed, because the cap's going to be going up anyway. We are seeing the pendulum in the league swing back towards the running game with lighter defenses, lighter fronts, lighter players, trying to take away more of the downfield passing game. Jonathan Taylor is worth more than ever. You even get a little bonus right now of he has 4 weeks that he's been resting while everyone else is getting beat up. There's so many teams. Miami comes to mind. If you're in a Super Bowl window and you think about teams that have impatient owners like Miami, and we know that Miami was in on Dalvin Cook, why would you not be in on that? I agree with you that I don't want to bring up the C word, but it makes you wonder if you're really just trying to win, how would this move not make sense, even from a fiscal standpoint, because you are getting him in his prime. So I like that. I like bringing up that point. Go ahead.
He's 24 years old.
Right.
I don't, none of this makes any sense. Again, he's 24. When he's healthy, there's not more than 4 or 5 running backs in the game better than him.
Right.
So everything makes sense if you want a running back. He's young, he's talented, he's at the top of his profession.
Right.
I mean, there's no reason to say no to him. And right now, you don't have to pay full price for him. Now you're going to have to pay him next season, right, with his contract, but you've got to pay good players anyway.
Right.
So the Colts, Jim Irsay, who's nuts, by the way.
Irrational, yeah.
Yeah. He paid a long snapper, for crying out loud.
Right.
So we know NFL owners have the money. They just don't want to pay running backs. Right. They want to pay every other position except this one, but they still want to use running backs. Right. They still want to give them 15, 20, 25 touches a game, the best ones, not all of them, right? We know that, but the best ones still want to get these touches. Mm-hmm. So they just don't want to pay them anymore. So but I don't understand this at all. It makes no sense.
Well, it only makes sense from a business standpoint, and this is where business encroaching on football. I mean, we as fantasy football analysts, we always have to be taking everything into account. So I'm not saying it should be part of our analysis, but I started calling it exploitative back in before all this stuff blew up with Taylor and the other running backs that felt really disrespected. Back in June or July, I was calling it exploitative because, Tom, it's almost like, imagine the most dangerous job, the job that nobody wants to do in some sort of industrial setting because of the high likelihood of injury. And because of that, the plant has to go through a lot of guys. And because of that, they pay them less, like the scariest job, because that's the deal, is that running backs get used up faster and faster with how brutal the NFL is. 30 used to be the cliff. Tom, I don't know if it's 27 or 28 now, but he's not near the cliff yet. He's not at the cliff. So that doesn't come into the discussion, but they're just driving down the value of all running backs because it has this feedback loop effect, because the price as running back salaries go down, how can the salary of any position be going down? And again, I'm not going to say collusion there. I just said it, but how can a position, as revenues are growing and the cap is growing, how can any position be going down in value. And yet when that happens, the franchise tag is worth less, which means you have even less of a chance of getting a long-term contract now, because teams basically can get you on a 7-year deal when they take you in the first round. So yes.
And
Oh,
the problem I have is these same owners and general managers who are saying, I'm not going to pay the running back, are turning around and paying these mediocre and less than mediocre quarterbacks confounding amounts of money. And obviously we saw it Monday night with Daniel Jones, and I don't want to make him as a scapegoat because there's others, but we can point to him because he played the most recent game and was terrible. But his contract stands out because he's also playing with a running back who is far more talented at his position and is also dealing with a contract situation this past summer, right? I mean, he's making 4 times the amount of money as his teammate who's far more talented and far more important to his football team.
Right.
And that's a problem. But you've also got the Ryan Tannehills of the world making significantly more money than he should be making. And you can point to Minnesota with Kirk Cousins. The second the Vikings signed Kirk Cousins, I was on Twitter saying they're doomed.
Yeah.
Not that Kirk Cousins is as bad as Jones or Tannehill. He's not. He's much better. But the problem with a Kirk Cousins is he puts you in quarterback purgatory.
Right.
He's just good enough to get you to a playoffs position, but he'll never get you to a Super Bowl.
Right.
So you can't ever get good enough, or you can't ever get good enough to win a Super Bowl, but you'll never be bad enough to get the quarterback you really need to win a Super Bowl.
Unless you trade 3 first-round picks for one and then trade him for a
right.
first-round
You're
pick.
overpaying stupidly. That's the problem.
Right.
With a guy like Cousins. And then you turn around, you overpay for a guy like Jones, and you're really screwed.
Right. It's tough. Yeah, the Giants look like they're in the same place we thought they were at the beginning of the year last year, except now they owe Daniel Jones a lot more money, but basically they're rebuilding. I love it. This is like two gray beards. We're getting it off our chest, right, at the NFL. It's good though, because I always like when we get a chance to talk Tom, because as I said, you were a beat writer for Green Bay, right? That was the team you covered, and it was the pre-fantasy football era, right?
I mean, it was pre, and then it was right when the era kind of took off.
Right.
It was right when it boomed.
So there wasn't the fantasy football lens the way, I mean, now beat writers have to understand fantasy football. I remember when we first started interviewing beat writers on this show back in 2007, we didn't want to say the word fantasy football. We thought that would cheapen. It's like we're at the children's table and they let us sit at the adults table. So we're not going to, we got an actual adult that covers football. We're not going to bring up fantasy football, even though we might be asking questions that have fantasy football relevance. But I always bring this up whenever we're talking, because I think you have the ability, because you've seen the game now from behind the scenes and you understand things. There's a lot of great stuff you learn behind the scenes that you can never tell anybody about, because, well, that's kind of how the access game works. But I'm just curious, again, I like to bring this up. Tell me something that as you're going through your prep, maybe for week 5, maybe earlier this year, maybe it was your draft prep, whatever it was, that your experience as a beat writer helped you have better fantasy analysis, where if you hadn't had that experience, you might not have seen that angle or understood, here's how to see through what you're learning or what the information that's out there, but here's what's real.
Well, I think, one thing I always like to look at, is how players are being utilized beyond just things that we kind of see, that we kind of, we kind of see obviously, right? Utilization is something that I think fantasy players have gotten much smarter about, but it's something that, I'll take an example like Roshan Johnson, for example. There was a lot of talk this past Sunday about Roshan Johnson and an expanded role. But here's the thing. The expanded role has to happen a lot more naturally than what it was. It was kind of like people were jumping on that, and it wasn't really something that we were seeing naturally, right? I mean, Khalil Herbert wasn't going anywhere. What was Khalil Herbert not doing in football games that was going to lead Roshan Johnson to suddenly grab that role from him? Right?
Right.
And so I think you have to, we all kind of want things to happen lead to our perspectives being taken correctly, right? And that's something that, when I'm watching these games, I see it through the lens of what I used to when I used to cover, when I used to cover the Packers or cover the NFL in general, because I'm watching the plays unfold when I was sitting in a press box and watching the players performing on the field. And I'm watching Roschon Johnson for how many ever games, and I like him very much, but I'm also watching Khalil Herbert. And so I'm watching this stuff and I'm like, well, what's Khalil Herbert not doing?
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. Because you can like this other guy a lot, but what is Khalil Herbert not doing that's going to lend Roschon Johnson to get more touches, right?
Right.
And so we got to weigh both sides of the equation before point B jumps over point A. And point A is Khalil Herbert being the starter. And I think that's something that fantasy players, they're in a rush to get to they're in a rush for point A to become validated without understanding that point B to become validated without point A losing. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, and I think that if I would unpack that too. One of the things I like to talk about, Tom, is in backfields, catnip for coaches is being assignment sound, and knowing
Yeah.
having a known quantity, knowing what they have. And I think to your point, we want these changes to happen. Maybe it's that quarterback mentality, right? Where we the backup quarterback's the most popular guy in town, right? We want, like you said, we want these things to happen, but actually, more often than not, unless you see the starter, Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, right? And even
Yes.
Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard was a good example where the things that we value about players, yards, touchdowns, receptions, aren't the same things that the coaches are valuing. And until you start seeing those things erode, the change isn't going to
And I'll give you another example in Jamal Williams, even a
happen.
better example. Here, and people used to ask me this when Jamal Williams played for the Packers. Jamal Williams used to come on the field all the time for Aaron Jones. And Aaron Jones, clearly more talented, right? And people would tweet me and email me and whatever and say, how come Aaron Jones is losing touches to Jamal Williams? And I'd be like, because here's the thing, we're all frustrated by this. I'm a Packers fan. I love Aaron Jones. I'm frustrated too, but here's the thing. Here's why it's happening. Jamal Williams, clearly less talented, doesn't mess up his assignments.
Right.
He's assignment proof, and coaches love that. He's never going to walk on the field and miss a block. In pass pro, he's not going to miss a blitz pickup. He's not going to miss an assignment. He's always going to do everything that at the time Mike McCarthy wants him to do.
Right.
And that's going to get him on the field, even at the expense of the much more talented Aaron Jones. It's going to drive you crazy as a
Right.
fan. It's going to drive you crazy as a fantasy player who has Aaron Jones. But that's why Jamal Williams is on the field. And last season in Detroit, it's why it got him on the field ahead of DeAndre Swift, who's obviously a much more talented player. And I was saying this all off season when Jamal Williams signed with the Saints. I was telling people he's going to get on the field ahead of Kendre Miller at the time, right? When Kamara was, headed for the suspension. I'm preparing everybody. This is exactly what's going to happen. Obviously Williams gets hurt now, before everything went down. I'm telling everybody who's getting super excited about Kendre Miller, I'm telling them this is what's going to happen the first 3 weeks, before Williams gets hurt, obviously. But this is what's going to happen.
Right.
This is why Williams going to be on the field. Just prepare yourself. I know you're excited about
You're
the
not going to
rookie.
like it. Yeah.
You're not going to like it, but this is why he's going to be on the field all these reps and snaps. That's what coaches love about Jamal Williams.
Right, right. Yep. And it's great because it is something that, like you said, you can start to see coming. And I meant to I wanted to tie a bow. I want to bring in the NFFC because you were doing great work. NFFC, great. If you're not playing NFFC high stakes, you're missing out. And I know that if we're looking at like that last week leading up to the season, Jonathan Taylor's ADP was falling. Cooper Kupp's ADP was falling. We don't know yet what the big reveal is going to be on these players. But as of right now, do you feel like the teams that took Kupp and the teams that took Taylor, and the answer might not be the same for both, are in a better situation because they were willing to take that leap?
Well, it certainly depends how they got where they're at now. Were they able to navigate, the first
Like 2-2. Are they
first
just
4 weeks?
2-2? Yeah.
Right. I mean, if they're 0-4, it's going to be tougher. But if they got through it 2-2 or 3-1 or even 4-0, I mean, I've got a team, for example, that's 4-0 that took Kupp in the first. So,
Yeah. Thank
well,
you. Can I just say something? Tom? When you said that, and I know we love this because this is those things that like fantasy football canards, right? And if you look up the word canard, you'll know what I mean when I call it a canard. You can't lose your draft in the first round. You can't.
right.
All that. So you can't win your draft in the first round, but you can't win your league in the first round, but you can lose it. No, you can't. No, you can't. You can blow your first round pick and still win. No problem. So thank you.
Well, I'm 4-0 because I won by a tenth of a point this past week after the two Mahomes kneel down. So
Oh,
I
that's
got a little
terrible.
lucky.
That's terrible.
So
We
anyway,
have
but no, it certainly depends how those teams navigated the first 4 weeks. So if you're able to navigate your way through them, you're right. I think you're sitting there right now feeling pretty good because you've got potentially, certainly with Kupp, maybe more than Taylor based off what happened last season.
right.
So, but certainly you feel like potentially a big shot in the arm right now. And again, if Kupp can play this week, that matchup is really, really good. Even if
Yeah.
Cooper Kupp is on a pitch count, I love the matchup. Again,
Yeah.
that Eagles secondary has had all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So Kupp more than Taylor, I think, has a chance to really be an high impact player. We'll see about Taylor. I certainly think the Colts offense has looked better. It took Richardson certainly, killed Mike Pittman this past Sunday, but
Yeah.
that could be an outlier. But
Mm-hmm.
I certainly think the Kupp people are feeling pretty good about themselves right
Oh
now if
yeah.
they're able to get through the first month.
Especially if because you had drafted Kupp, it made you more likely to be aggressive going after Puka Nacua after week
Right.
one. So
Exactly. And in the
it,
NFFC, we saw a lot of hefty fab bids for Nacua on the waiver wire. Absolutely.
which are working out. So Puka Nacua is
Yep.
going to be there for us. Tom, if Puka Nacua did not have another fantasy relevant week all year, he's still probably one of the 3 or 5 most valuable pickups of the year already. Just because I
He's
think what
yep.
people overestimate is in a typical year, we might have 2 or 3 true impact players on the waiver wire. Maybe 2 or
Yep.
3. And there's players that help you for windows 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or something like that. But a Puka Nacua, a Kyron Williams, it's going to stand for be bold in week one, be bold for the most obvious pickup, but also know that what we see could be the beginning of paths that are going to diverge because we didn't know that the Rams were going to straight out dump Cam Akers, but we knew after 1 week that they liked Kyron Williams better. All right, turning the page. Well, let's talk about this week's waiver wire run and NFFC in terms of players that didn't get a Puka Nacua in week one and might be sitting on a lump sum that they can spend. Do you think it's smart for them to spend on Jaleel McLaughlin this week?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a week to week game now, right now, right? I think it has been for the last few years. So what we're seeing in the NFFC. I mean, we do a segment on our Sirius show every week. We do a Fab segment because our show is Wednesday night, and Fab runs our first Fab period runs on Wednesday night. So we do a Fab segment, and we are seeing hefty bids every single week now. And I do think there is. Derek Butcher and I host a show, and we talk about it. I think there is kind of a FOMO feeling.
Mm-hmm.
That fear that if you didn't get Nacua, for example, after week 1 or 2, everybody's kind of feeling like, man, I did miss out. I better go heavy on the next big guy. And this week, I think it'll be Jaleel McLaughlin. And, we don't know how long Javonte Williams will be out. I think he'll be out this week for sure. The matchup isn't great, but we did see Pacheco run all over the Jets. So maybe Denver can do it too. Who knows? But I think, yeah, the bids will be pretty hefty for him. And if it's 1 week or even 2, but even if it's just 1 week and you get, 15 points or luck out. Maybe it's
Right.
more, 15 to 20. If that can get you a week, get you back into something, hey, it's worth it. I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and the opportunity McLaughlin. You're right. I always say McLaughlin because I love John McLaughlin, the guitarist. McLaughlin.
Yeah.
Cecil told me that McLaughlin. He has an opportunity. Javonte Williams likely sitting for a couple of weeks to put his stamp on the backfield, which he
Yeah.
kind of already did last week when he got in. And Sean Payton said his role is going to grow. So yeah, if you're a coach like Sean Payton saying I'm going to use my undrafted free agent rookie running back more, he's probably going to see more work. And we saw what he did with just like 10 touches last week, over 100 total yards
Yeah.
and a touchdown. Let's talk about hope. We need to have hope, or maybe hope is a bad thing because it continues to be fluid, continues to be mercurial. I've talked about a few things, Tom, like already. Detroit and Houston have good defenses. Wait a second. What? We actually watched them have bad defenses in week 2. In week 2, you'd say Houston to Detroit. These are two of the defenses you want to target. And now you're watching them and thinking, wow, these are good defenses. I might even use the Detroit defense or the Houston defense in my fantasy league. How long has it been since we said that? How long has it been since we said Atlanta has a functional passing game? Should we be waiting around for Taylor Heineke? Should we be holding on to our Drake London and Kyle Pitts and thinking better times are coming? Or is that give you the one last window to sell these players?
Well, I think, boy, I think certainly if you can get something for them now, I think, yeah, make the move. Pull the trigger. If somebody's willing to give you something for them, pull the trigger. I wouldn't wait around, but I can't imagine if Ritter fails again this week.
Sit.
I gotta think they pull him. I mean, you don't not that Taylor Heineke's anything more than Taylor Heineke, but he is a decent backup at least. I mean, you don't bring him in and leave him on the bench all year and let Desmond Ritter fail week in and week out. I
Right.
gotta think they pull him if it's another disaster. I mean, it's been 2 games now, just a disaster. So I mean, you're just making nothing out of London and Pitts at this. And London flashed so strong at the end
Yeah.
of last year with Ritter that to have this go on. Now, I understand Pitts has kind of been a disaster since his rookie year, but London was so good at the end of last year that to have nothing out of him now, I,
It
what
hurts.
a disappointment this
Yeah.
is.
It hurts. It hurts. And like you said, Michael Pittman until last week, it was funny because you saw Pittman, Moore, and London were all clear number one receivers on offenses where we weren't quite sure about the pass volume and we weren't quite sure about the pass efficiency. And you saw Shane Steichen, and maybe again, who's the play caller? Shane Steichen had a nice funnel on those RPOs. Michael Pittman, the first read, just worked from day one. Last week, Anthony Richardson had a little tougher time throwing the ball. That's fine. DJ Moore, we just needed the Bears to finally loosen up well to play the Broncos. We'll see if it sticks. But once he loosened up and felt a little more in tune with the game and not like a robot, as he put it. But the Drake London thing, it's just terrible. And I mean, if I'm going to say take the side of false hope, and I'm an optimist because I prefer it to the alternative, there's so many catchable balls there. I mean, there's so many potential plays where fantasy value's there for Pitts and London. They just don't, again, have the quarterback to actually harness it. And Taylor Heineke, I'll say this for Taylor Heineke, Tom, he's going to go down swinging, right? He's not a
Yep.
meek quarterback out there. He hasn't seen a throw he doesn't want to try. So while this offense might be limiting in terms of volume, he's not going to be he's not going to play scared. He's not going to play scared as a passer. And when you have London and Pitts on the other end of passes, that could work out. So there's my false hope. What about Zach Wilson? I mean, I joked, I said, if you're Zach Wilson, when you turn the corner, there's just another corner around the corner. But it looked like his teammates were having some confidence in him a little bit. Maybe. Is this going to get better?
Yeah, I don't think anybody was expecting what we saw on Sunday night, and certainly the Chiefs weren't defensively. That was a disaster for them. But they were so passive. I don't know what their scheme was defensively. I mean, they were so good the last 2 weeks in particular, but they just didn't attack him at all. But obviously, if you're streaming or you're playing DFS this week, I mean, hey, the Broncos, they're the
Exactly.
Broncos for crying out loud. I mean, why wouldn't you play Zach? I mean, if you got Joe Burrow for crying out loud, why wouldn't you pick up Zach Wilson and play Zach Wilson over Joe Burrow right now? I mean, it's the Broncos, for crying out
Right.
loud, right? They give points up to every quarterback, and Wilson's playing with confidence. He's got Garrett. Well, we know that Brees Hall is going to get going. The only concern
Yes.
for Zach Wilson is that Brees Hall would score every touchdown, right?
Right.
That's the only possible concern I would have, is that Brees Hall runs for every single touchdown on Sunday. That's the
Right.
only possible concern I would have.
Right. And then I think what you get, Tom, is a feedback loop again where Zach Wilson has success. I mean, for the Jets, they win. Let's see, they should be able to beat Denver. And then that creates more positive vibes around Zach Wilson as the starter. And I mean, what a perfect time for Denver to come up on the schedule for them. And the Chiefs, like you said, they had been a really tough defense, a really good defense until last week. And we'll see. We'll see if it's the aberration. We were so quick to pin week 1 games as aberrations, but sometimes they're aberration games during the season, like Washington against Buffalo, for instance. That offense looks pretty good. Let's go back to Green Bay, since that's your old stomping grounds as a beat writer. What do you think is the answer with Aaron Jones and Christian Watson now finally not on a pitch count going into this game in Las Vegas? And Gene Bramall, who did amazing work for us for a long time, pointed out to me years and years ago, Green Bay has one of the most conservative medical staffs in the league. So it wasn't really that much of a surprise that they said, well, okay, it's a Thursday game, so they can play, but they can only play 20 snaps or whatever it was. But now you have, on one hand, Tom, you have gridlock. You have potential gridlock where there's just too many options. It's a low volume pass offense. It's a low efficiency offense. Now, Jordan Love could continue to step up in quality, and maybe how he gets there is having these good players out there. Or it could just make, like the Kansas City wide receivers, right? It could just make it so that if you are trying to count on anybody in this offense, maybe even Aaron Jones, every week you're going to be hurting.
I don't think it's going to be like Kansas City, because I think their wide receivers are better than Kansas City, honestly.
Uh-huh.
The tight end's not, clearly, but I think the offense will revolve around Jones, like we pretty much saw week 1. I think he's their focal point, so I'm not worried about him if he's healthy and not on a pitch count. And then it goes off from there. And I think their best wide receivers are Watson when he's healthy, which is a big question and a big concern, because
Right.
he just hasn't been healthy for his whole career to this point. And then after that, it's Romeo Doubs. He's number 2 or 1B. And then they'll fill in from there. Maybe a little bit Jaden Reed and other guys. And then maybe they get a little bit of Luke Musgrave. We'll see if he plays. Because like you said, they've been super conservative. I know he practiced yesterday, and we'll see about today. And it's a longer break after the concussion. But most guys do not return first game back from a concussion. So we'll see if he does play. But anyway, a little bit of him, we'll see. But I do think Jones is fine. And again, Dillon's been so bad.
Oh,
That helps Aaron Jones. So the offense revolves around him, and then they'll pass off that with Watson and Doubs and little Jaden Reed and so forth. So I'm not worried about Jones. And the matchup on Monday night is really, really good, obviously, because the Raiders are just trash.
and Jordan Love, just your take. Again, like kind of a sports talk radio take, but if they have an answer, have they found it? Like, based on what you've seen through 4 weeks, do you think it's more likely they found an answer, or they're going to have to go back to the drawing board?
I think, he's been better, I think, than the stats and the metrics show. I know the metrics haven't been kind to him. I know he's missed a lot of throws. But honestly, and I'm not a Jordan Love guy. Anybody who follows me on Twitter or listens to
Mm-hmm.
our show on Sirius, they know I'm not a Love guy. I never wanted him to be drafted. I was a T Higgins guy that whole draft.
Maybe they can still get T
So
Higgins. They won't.
well, no, they won't. That's not who they are. Um, but I've been generally impressed with him. What I like most about him is he hangs tough in the pocket.
Yeah.
He stands tall and strong in the pocket. He doesn't perceive pressure when it's not there, which a lot of young quarterbacks do. Daniel Jones, for example, I can't say I blame him. I mean, he got sacked, 10 times?
Right.
He was bailing under pressure all night long on Monday night. But Love hasn't done that. He stands strong in the pocket. And he's got a good arm, obviously. He can throw, he can make every throw that I've
Yep.
seen so far. And he's running the offense that LaFleur wants him. I don't know what the scheme or the game plan was Thursday night against the Lions. It was a horrible game plan by LaFleur, but I think he's done pretty well. I've generally been pretty impressed to this point so far.
Yeah, and I think that you see LaFleur coming from the Shanahan tree, and if you look at it in a Shanahan lens, Jordan Love has been good enough to get what the scheme creates and what the plays
Yeah.
create. And like you said, the scheme and the plays. And let's give some credit to Detroit's defense again. Wow, Detroit's defense has really transformed in just a matter of a few weeks, and not necessarily because of personnel. Just it's starting to come together. And poor Bryce Young this week. I think Bryce Young looks like they're sending him in to like the knife fight with the plastic fork right now, and they don't trust him yet, and that's tough. But I understand why they would trust Jordan Love, and it's going to be interesting to see what the future brings. Let's talk about Devin Achane real quick, because I think that we're at a fork in the road. Look, there are points, Tom. I know you know what I mean when I say this. Like whatever a player's value is right now, I know it's not going to stay there. Right? Like Devin Achane's going to do this again against the Giants and again. And it doesn't matter if Jeff Wilson's back, and it doesn't matter if Jeff Wilson gets goal line carries. It doesn't matter. Like every week, he's going to find a way to do this. And I didn't get him in as many leagues as I wanted, but because he got hurt before some of my drafts. But I mean, I felt like, wow, looking at the room that this offense opens up in defenses, an accelerator back, a shifty, fast acceleration back is exciting. I never could have dreamed it would have went like this. And maybe it's just because, well, it was Denver. Buffalo's not a bad run defense, so maybe not. But you saw the snaps go in Achane's favor last week. So I think if you trade for Achane right now, even based on his current price, because I don't think you'd have to pay a running back one price for him, even though he's been like the running back one the last 2 weeks, right? I don't think you'd have to pay that much for him. I mean, you might be able to, you might be surprised. You might be able to trade like Kyron Williams for him or something like that. Somebody who's been producing also that we didn't expect. Or he could come back to earth with his 8 to 12 touches a game, and it could just be that this was a blip. Which side are you more likely to take here?
I mean, there are so few running backs right now you can depend on, right? It's a bleak position to this point this year. It really is.
Earlier, yeah.
It really is. I mean, that's why. I mean, I'll get back to Achane, but I was talking about this the other day. I mean, as great as Justin Jefferson is to this point, I would take Christian McCaffrey #1 overall in the draft if I was redoing it, hands down.
Right.
Because there's nobody else. It's him and Bijan, right? At the top of drafts at running back right now. And McCaffrey obviously is just far and away. He's so much better than everybody else. Running back is so bleak. But as far as Achane, yeah, I'd be in if I could get him. And I'd be willing to pay up to get him. Because first of all, I believe in that offense, even though they got outclassed this past Sunday. Buffalo's just that good right now.
That seems like their division opponents they're not afraid of them. The Jets, the Patriots, the Bills, they know them, and they're not. The other teams, though, play on their heels, and they give it up basically before the game starts almost.
But the Bills can match them for speed. I mean, they can. Diggs is fast. Davis is fast. Cook is fast. I mean, they're not maybe as fast as Hill and Waddle and Achane, but the Bills got team speed. So they're not afraid to get out there and run with those guys. Right. So that's the thing that a lot of other teams, when they get on the field with the Dolphins, they can't run with them. The Bills are like, we'll run with those guys. We may not be able to run Diggs with Tyreek, but we can run Diggs past just about anybody else.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the X factor there. So, I mean, even the Chiefs probably can't run quite like the Bills can. So, but as far as Achane, we're like, he's going to regress. Yeah, he regressed, but he's still like you said, RB1A, right?
Yeah, yeah.
He didn't regress a lot. So I'd pay, because who else they got in that backfield that can do this?
Right.
I mean, they got to keep finding ways to get him on the field and utilize that speed. Now they got to figure out a way to do it when they're not down 41-10 or whatever it was on Sunday. But I think they'll figure this out. And he's a weapon for them. And the more you have that kind of speed that you can utilize both. The nice thing is runner and receiving threat. That's the thing that makes him so dangerous is he's a 3-down threat for them with that speed. So I think they're going to figure that out. And yeah, I'd be willing to pay, and I'd be willing to pay up to get that.
Yeah, I think you're right too. There also might be something at play here where teams are willing to say we're going to take away the big play in the passing game, and if that leaves more running lanes, then that leaves more. I mean,
Yeah.
if that makes it easier to run, then look, if you're a defense, then if the ball ends up in Devin Achane's, I know that this sounds ridiculous based on what's happened the last 2 weeks, but on a play, if the ball ends up in Devin Achane's hands, you're okay with that. Like you'd rather have that than Hill or Waddle targeted downfield. Like you would rather have to corral him than worry about Hill and Waddle downfield. I guess that's kind of that Bill Belichick way of thinking about it. Speaking of that, let's go again like a kind of sports talk radio, because all of a sudden, Tom, all you hear is, oh, could Belichick get fired? Is this the end for Belichick? You know, and it does happen exactly when he loses his 2 best defensive players. So there's a parallel, or there's something happening here where as this team gets weaker, you know, like it's the Emperor. I called that team, the Brady Belichick team, the Death Star. I said the Titans blew up the Death Star when they beat them in the playoffs that year, and we knew that Brady was leaving. He's like the Emperor now that's like withering without his Darth Vader. Do you believe it? I mean, do you think that we could just see that indeed from up top they might say the game is passing him by, or do you think he'll get to go out on his own terms?
I don't know if the game is so much passing him by as so much he's like anybody else who doesn't have a good quarterback. I mean,
Right.
it's hard to win when your quarterback stinks. And his quarterback stinks. I'm sorry, Mac Jones stinks.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you want to put something on Bill Belichick, I would say this. He's done a horrible job. We all know this, but he's done a horrible job of drafting wide receivers.
Yeah.
I mean, even when Brady was there, they drafted horrible wide receivers. It's just that Brady was so damn good, he made their crappy wide receivers look good. I mean, and then they had guys who weren't crappy, right? I mean, the slot, all their slot wide receivers were really good. And then they had Moss come in for a while, and he obviously wasn't crappy, but they drafted. And then what are you doing letting Jacoby Myers go?
Right.
I mean, who made that decision? Who in their front office looked at their roster and said, we'll let him go and bring in Juju Smith-Schuster? I mean,
Right.
who did that?
It had to be Belichick. I mean, there's no one. And what's funny, you brought this up, Tom. He himself has admitted. Belichick has said a long time ago. He said, "Yeah, it seems like we do better scouting pro wide receivers than we do college receivers. Like it was easier for them to find one, and that's why. But then they turn around and trade for Devontae Parker, which isn't exactly helping very much either. But you're right; it's a blind spot. He's never. I mean, they did go after DeAndre Hopkins, who's I think about to come on for Tennessee. I like him in the matchup. Go ahead.
Even he's on the downside.
Yeah.
Of his, I mean, there's nothing left with him at this point.
Right.
I
mean,
and
they've traded N'Keal Harry. They tried a ton of like 3rd and 4th round receivers. Like none of them stuck. None of them panned out. I think there was the one kid who panned out who had a terrible. It's escaping me. I think but he had a bad. He was good at first, and then his knee doomed him. Anyway, it's a road littered with failure.
Yeah.
And now you see, like you said, they're the opposite end of the spectrum from the Bills and Miami as far as we can run with you. They can't run with anybody. So that's a problem in the NFL right now. And it's just interesting that we've come all the way around to nothing ever comes of it. Nothing ever comes of it. Just Bill Belichick is now not exactly spoken with about in high esteem around the NFL. Let's see, as we wind up, let's try to kind of skate to where the puck's going to be instead of where the puck is. I even told folks last week, like maybe depending on your league, it might be time to pick up Kyler Murray. Do you think Kyler Murray is going to have an influence on this year's fantasy season, whether it be his own play or what he does for the already surprisingly good value in Connor, Marquise Brown, Michael Wilson, who might be a waiver wire pickup this week? What do you think about Kyler Murray and his influence on this season?
First of all, I do like Michael Wilson, by the way. But boy, what is he going to do that Josh Dobbs isn't doing right now?
That's fair.
I mean, Josh Dobbs is playing really well. I mean, he should have one more touchdown last week. I mean, what are you doing, Zach Ertz?
Against San Francisco.
Yeah. Against 40. By the way, the 40, if you got the 49er defense in fantasy, they're not set and forget anymore. I mean,
No,
they're not putting up
neither
numbers
is
on defense,
Philadelphia.
but yeah. But anyway, I mean, it really depends on the next few weeks for Dobbs, I think, and it's not a scary matchup for Dobbs this week at home against the Bengals. I mean, um, yeah, I really like what the Cardinals are doing. I think they are the positive surprise story of the season. I think the Jaguars are the negative surprise story.
Mm-hmm.
I know they won this past Sunday, but I I'm not overly impressed by them. They should have won. It was an easy matchup for them. But I like the Cardinals. I think they're playing well. I think Dobbs is playing very well. And if he keeps playing well, I just don't know why you would take him out of the lineup, because the fact of the matter is, I know Kyler put up decent fantasy numbers last season, but he didn't play good football last year at all.
Right, right. Well, and then the question becomes was how much of that was Cliff Kingsbury holding him back? But I do think between Josh Dobbs and Jordan Love, Tom, this is I'm going to go. I'll take this right into off the rails because whatever. It's a little bit earlier than 10 minutes, but there's always more to talk about than the 10 minutes we do at the end where we talk about whatever. But I'll start with football. Is again we're making the case for some quarterbacks need to be in the incubator for a few years. Some quarterbacks you're not going to
Yeah.
see what they're capable of at first, especially like they're not everyone's going to be CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson and which quarterbacks are out there that if like they deserve a shot now, but they're not getting it because well the NFL wants to play first round pick quarterbacks over whoever. And that's an old school way of thinking about quarterback development. So I'll ask you again, Tom, how long have you been around the NFL now? Are you, I mean, is it almost like 30 years, more than 30 years?
30. I'm not that old.
Yeah.
Well, I started covering the Packers in 99, so
Okay.
almost
Almost 25.
24, 25 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So 25 years, the game has changed, right?
Yep.
When you reflect back on the game that you were covering in 1999 and the game that you're watching so closely right now, what stands out as things that have changed, or maybe something people think have changed, but it really hasn't, or it can even be something that hasn't changed, and that gives you comfort as you reflect over being so close to the NFL for so long.
Well, I mean, I think the game is pretty much the same, honestly. The game itself it hasn't changed a great deal. Certainly the information has that we have access to has changed significantly, obviously. What you were talking about before, uh, the league's embrace of fantasy football has changed
Mm-hmm.
monumentally. And everything that we see and we watch on game days, on Thursdays, Sundays, Mondays, whenever the game may be, Saturdays late in the year, everything we see is directed to the fantasy football audience, whether we realize it or not.
Right, right.
Every
We've taken
graphic,
over.
every highlight, everything. Because you think back to think back to 20, 10, 15, 20 years ago, basically you turn on a football game, all you would see would be the score and maybe the down and distance.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. And occasionally you'd get a highlight from another game. Occasionally.
Right.
Now what do you see? You see the score, down and distance, you see stats, running stat totals,
Yep.
you get constant updates. Of course, we've got the red zone. I'm not even talking about the red zone channel. I'm talking about in-game, constant updates, constant screen updates from other games going on with statistical updates from those within those games, running stat totals from those games going on. Everything is catered, whether you realize it or not, to the fantasy sports player. That's how dominant this industry, the fantasy football industry, has become, and the NFL embraces it.
Yeah, as they should, because it drives interest in the
Yeah.
league. It's what gets people. I mean, you almost might think it's a die. I know there are a lot of people out there like conspiracy theories, like Taylor Swift's being paid by the league, or maybe Taylor Swift's paying the NFL to bump Taylor Swift. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, right? But
Yep.
it's almost like a diabolical scheme that like, how can we get people to watch football games they don't care about? Well, really, it was gambling. It always was gambling, right? Some of us might have memories of on Sunday mornings our fathers talking to some person who like calling them up and putting bets and things like that. Now you don't have to do that. Now you just to put it on your phone or something like that. But it's a way of bridging those two worlds. And like you said, I mean, fantasy football is so pervasive. There was an article, I don't know if you saw it, Tom, in the Athletic about the NHL and their fantasy leagues. Like that each team has a fantasy league. And they went to the teams like, who's the commissioner? What happened in your league last year? Who's winning? Who just got started? Like it's big enough in NHL culture that their fantasy leagues, we had that situation with baseball. I think it was Jock Peterson got slapped by Tommy Pham over a fantasy football argument.
Yeah.
Where it's bleeding over, where fantasy football is even a story in other sports. Now, let me ask you: when you were covering the Packers back in '99, were you already a fantasy guy back then?
Yeah. Yes.
So what was your perception back then of how aware players were, or other people covering the game, or what was it on the radar?
No, no, it was not nowhere near as players weren't that aware of it. It wasn't no, like I said, it later in I left the beat in 99. So later in my beat years, it started to get a little more relevant, a little more players became a little more familiar with it, but it wasn't until the 2000s that the boom really took off.
Yeah, and it's and even players, right? I guess players are they. I guess fantasy football is okay. It's funny, by the way, that the NFL backtracked and said, "Well, how about 4 games instead of 6 games for these suspensions for gambling?"
Right.
Tom, I can remember whenever the perception was there will never be an NFL franchise in Las Vegas. It will never happen because it's too much of potential like appearance of impropriety and things like that. But it changes. It certainly changes. You mentioned analytics, so I'll ask you that, or the numbers that are available. And maybe it was just not something you intentionally like presented, but you said the numbers that we have available. I'm curious your thoughts on, because I've always thought that we find stuff and we think, oh, this is revolutionary. And the good organizations, there are bad organizations out there. The good organizations were always aware of these things. What do you think about, like, do you think that we are kind of ahead of the curve and driving some of this stuff? Or do you think the NFL has always known about this stuff and we're actually the Johnny come latelys?
No, I think the good organizations have always been aware of it. I think as an industry, uh, we're I think we're probably with the curve. I don't know if we're driving anything. I think honestly, I think baseball probably does maybe fantasy baseball players are maybe a little more progressive in terms of driving a lot of things. They're honestly fantasy baseball players probably a little more progressive in terms of driving analytics
Uh-huh.
um,
Oh, some of the
than
baseball
fantasy football.
analytics. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think maybe they're a little more progressive than fantasy football because there's so much more data
Mm-hmm.
I think there is in than fantasy football because there's just so many more games involved. I could be wrong about that, but that's just my take. But I do think that fantasy football players are certainly doing a good job of that. But I don't know if there's anything that's revolutionary per se, at least that I've seen. And again, if I'm wrong about that, feel free to tweet some
No,
stuff
no.
at me and let me know. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right in so much. It's interesting because I always used to say I love football. In part, I would point to a piece that Chuck Klosterman wrote that was on ESPN page 2 back when they had their blog. It was an excerpt from his book where he talked about how the NFL is kind of open ended. Like there are these rules. He talked about the A11 offense and things like that. Like you can basically do anything that is not prohibited by the rules. So it's kind of progressive. It's always changing. It's a copycat league, and we've seen some different things, but they're small and they kind of are blips like the Wildcat was for a little bit, or this tush push thing. Well, I mean, no one doesn't, it doesn't think anyone can do it except for Philadelphia the right way anyway. And you're seeing though in baseball, it was so dramatic that they changed the rules. Like the analytics with shifts were so dramatic that they said we need to change the rules of the game because it's changing the game in a way that they don't want it to be changed. I know you mentioned fantasy baseball. Are you a baseball guy? Have you been following baseball? Or is there any of your brain cells that are paying attention to the MLB playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, we run the NFBC, so I do pay attention. I will admit though, I'm more of a football guy. That's just my background. Obviously, having covered the NFL for as long as I did, I'm more of a football guy than a baseball guy. But I'm certainly paying attention. I'll see if the Brewers can hang in there
Yeah.
and
What happened?
rally.
Devin
Uh,
Williams yesterday. He was
yeah,
supposed to be
so
the
that
reason
wasn't
that
a
they
good
could go all
start.
the way.
Well, I'm just hoping they can win a series or two, but it was not a good start last night.
No, well, then Brandon Woodruff. They were supposed to have the best trio of starters of any of the teams in the NL, maybe of any of the teams in the playoffs on either side, and then one of them is hurt, Brandon Woodruff. So I'm a
Yeah,
long-suffering Pirates fan, so I just live vicariously through other fan bases.
yeah,
But no, you're right about baseball because I've my first dream as a tyke wanting to picture my future was to be the play-by-play announcer for the Pittsburgh Pirates. So I grew up more. I listened to the games on the radio. I had my own little
yep,
scorebook that I would update the stats as I was listening to the game. Update their RBIs and home runs and things like that.
yep,
And like you said about baseball stats, there's access to stuff now when you watch baseball where they'll say, when he throws a slider 2-2 to right-handed batters, the third time through the order, they're hitting
yep.
455 when they pull the ball. And I mean, it'd be like, just, and I think we could get there certainly with outfits like PFF tracking so many things, because that's what you got to start. You got to track everything. And you really could get down to, when it's 3rd and 7 and longer and they throw to the slot receiver who runs an in-breaking route and they get the ball out in under 2.5 seconds, they have, 120 passer rating. Now, the funny thing, though, is Warren Sharp does some stuff like that. I mean, you can certainly look at what Warren Sharp is doing to tell a story with data, but we still would have teams that would just ignore it, right? There'd be teams that, like, the data would say, stop doing this. It doesn't work, and they would
Yeah.
still ignore it.
I had access to some of that stuff when I was covering the Packers, so it was in the very early infancy stages, and this was, of course, back in the '90s. So it's obviously much more advanced today. So I was doing some of that
Mm-hmm.
when I was, prepping for games every week, doing my analysis and doing my previews of games. So that's the kind of stuff I like doing because it was allowing me to dig deeper into the prep work that I was doing because I my favorite stuff to do when I was a beat writer was analyzing the games and analyzing
Mm-hmm.
matchups. It's why I love fantasy so much, and it's why I love. People ask me, do you like best ball or do you like in season? I'm like, I love in season because it's the prep work,
Right.
right? I mean, best ball is fun. It's great. I love it. I love drafting and all that. But what I really love is the prep work and the analysis each week, preparing my team and analyzing the matchups because it's exactly what I did as a beat writer. So that's what I gravitate toward the most.
Give me one. I'll leave on one last thing. Give me one name of a beat writer who maybe is still around, maybe isn't, from back in the time that you were a beat writer that you remember fondly.
Well, I'll give you two because the best beat writer I ever worked alongside or who worked the same beat as me, and he's in the Hall of Fame, the NFL Hall of Fame, was Bob McGinn.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, he was the best. And I learned so much just watching him. But also, my cousin, Tom Mulhern, who passed away a few years ago, also worked on the Packers beat. And again, I learned a lot. And the fact that he was my cousin was meant a lot as well. But Tom gave me great advice. Like one of the first few days I was on the beat, he said, never write something that you're not afraid to back up walking into the locker room the next day. And it was perfect advice. And I took that to heart. I lived with it for 10 years on the beat because honestly, you walk in that locker room having written something, the players or whoever, players, coaches, whoever, you better be able to back that up the next day because they will come at you if you're not able to back it up. And if you can't, you're not going to be able to last on that beat. And I lasted 10 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's great advice. And that's why if you listen to Tom Kessenich, if you do check out the show on Wednesdays on SiriusXM and follow him on Twitter and all this stuff, you're going to get fantasy advice that is backed up by a lot of very good experience and knowledge. We want to bring you the best folks always because you're the very best audience out there anywhere. We love you so much.